WGAL News 8's Commitment 2018 election coverage of the race for the 10th U.S. Congressional District.
Tonight, hear from the two men running to represent Dauphin and parts of Cumberland and York counties, Republican Congressman Scott Perry and Democrat George Scott. Good evening, everybody. I'm Janelle Stelson.
And I'm Mike Straub. We welcome you to this WGAL Commitment 2018 debate for the 10th Congressional U.S. House seat.
Our goal tonight, find out where the candidates stand on the issues to help you become a more informed voter. We're pleased to be partnering with the American Association of University Women, which promotes equity and education for women and girls.
The newly formed 10th District, much of which used to be the 4th, includes all of Dauphin County and parts of Cumberland and York County, including York, Harrisburg, and Carlisle.
Both candidates are with us tonight. We begin with their introductions.
Congressman Scott Perry graduated from Northern High School and Cumberland Perry Votech. He enlisted in the Army National Guard and served in Iraq, as well as Bosnia-Herzegovina, South Korea, Germany, and Honduras. Perry earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration Management at Penn State, and he got his master's degree in Strategic Studies at the U.S. Army War College. He started his own mechanical contracting firm, then served 3 terms in the State House. Scott Perry has been a congressman for the 4th District since 2013 and is married with 2 children.
George Scott graduated from Littlestown High School and graduated Georgetown University with a degree in international politics. He served in the Army for 20 years, including deployments to Korea, Iraq, and Jordan. Scott attended the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, earning a Master of Divinity, then began serving as a pastor in East Berlin, Adams County. George Scott is married with 2 children.
Here is the format for tonight. Prior to tonight's debate, the candidates drew for question order.
Well, the first candidate is going to get 1.5 minutes to answer each question. Then the other will get 1 minute to respond. We also will allow time for rebuttals or a little back and forth if we need to. And at the end, the candidates will make a pitch for your vote with a closing statement.
All right. Let's get right to it, gentlemen. Thank you both for being here. Our first question goes to the winner of the draw. That was Congressman Perry. So, Congressman, every American, regardless of location, income, or age, relies on our health care system in one way or another. The costs of care, insurance, and medicine continue to rise to the point of forcing some Americans into bankruptcy. What will you fight for to ensure all Americans have access to reliable and affordable health care?
What will I fight for? I will tell you one thing that I'm really privileged and proud to fight for and to clarify at this debate is this issue of pre-existing conditions. We all knew that we wanted to repeal Obamacare, and I wanted to repeal Obamacare because it is bad law. It is actually so bad that even Democrats are running away from it. They're not trying to salvage it anymore. They're actually looking for single-payer and complete government-run health care. But at the time we were repealing Obamacare, Paul Ryan put forth a bill, right, to replace it. And if you recall when that happened, that bill failed on the first try, if you recall all that. And we kind of stumbled and stubbed our toe. One of the reasons it failed is because it didn't adequately deal with pre-existing conditions. I know hundreds of people, including people in my own family, that have pre-existing conditions. We knew that insurance companies were denying people the care that and the coverage that they should have just because of pre-existing conditions. And a bunch of us, myself included, said, absolutely not. We will not vote for this bill for myriad reasons. The most important one is not dealing with pre-existing conditions. And the bill that we passed, finally, that failed in the Senate, dealt with pre-existing conditions completely and disallowed insurance companies to restrict people from care or coverage for pre-existing conditions.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Scott, what will you fight for to ensure affordable health care?
Well, I'll fight for the people of the 10th Congressional District, all of whom, as well as everyone in our nation, deserves affordable and accessible health care. And I'll do that first by repairing and stabilizing the Affordable Care Act. It was certainly not a perfect piece of legislation, and yet it extended health care coverage to millions of Americans who had no coverage before. To say that it's a perfect system, or not a perfect system rather, doesn't mean that it's not good. And so we need to take that as the foundation and build going forward. We need to increase access to preventative care, which prevents the long-term bills. And we need to make sure that there is coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. My opponent has said that he is in favor of sustaining that, and yet there were two separate occasions. First in 2013 when he voted for House Resolution 45, and then again in 2015 when he voted for House Resolution 596 that would have repealed the Affordable Care Act in its entirety to include coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. I want to make sure that we have coverage for those with pre-existing conditions, but that we go further and try to cover these escalating costs so that all Americans will be able to benefit and not be worried about whether or not they can provide for themselves or their loved ones.
Congressman, he brought you up by name there. Do you want to respond?
Sure, I think I do. Absolutely. We ran on, many of us, on repealing Obamacare because it has failed. And like I said, even Democrats are running away from it. The costs are spiraling. Most counties in the country, across the country, only have 2 insurers under the exchanges. And the cost deductibles have quadrupled, right? And you think that when the deductible goes higher, your premium goes lower, but not with the ACA, not with Obamacare. So even though I did vote to repeal, there was always a place in mind to replace that with a better system, which is what I voted on and voted for.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen.
Are you saying that Mr. Scott's ad saying you are against that is misleading then?
I say that ad is a lie. I think that Mr. Scott knows better, and I know it's a lie because there was always the intention to deal with pre-existing conditions every single time, and that was made clear at the time we passed that bill.
Mr. Scott, anything to say about that?
And yet he voted twice for legislation that completely repealed the care in the ACA for those with pre-existing conditions with no legislation in place to replace it.
The premise is flawed in that the only way to deal with pre-existing conditions is through Obamacare. That's simply false. And the plan now with this health care for all at $33 trillion, I mean, we're going to double everybody's payroll tax. We're going to double employer taxes. I mean, there's no plan to pay for that. That's the alternative solution to the ACA from the other side. Untenable.
Okay, we're going to move along. Mr. Scott, our partner, the American Association of University Women, which promotes women's issues, cites research that Cumberland County, in your district, has one of the greatest pay gaps in the entire state between top earners and the working poor. We know states, even cities, can set their minimum wages, but are you in favor of raising the minimum wage? It has not gone up from $7.25 at the federal level or in Pennsylvania since 2009. Mr. Scott.
Yes, I do support raising the minimum wage, but doing so gradually, particularly so that small businesses, which could potentially be affected by that most greatly, have time to adjust. So a gradual increase in the minimum wage is long overdue. Part of the reason I say that is because in my ministry, I have seen family after family come in with people who are working full time and yet at the end of the day cannot afford to make ends meet. And this is not just unique to South Central Pennsylvania. We as a nation have this going on. The United Way recently brought out a study that shows that 43% of the households in our nation at the end of the month cannot afford to pay for the basic necessities of life. Certainly we have an economy that's expanding, and that's great, but the economy is not expanding in a way that is lifting up everyone. And for many people, they don't have that boat for a rising tide to lift. In fact, they're just stuck trying to tread water as the tide rises. We need to make sure that they are given help. Part of that help is through increasing the minimum wage, but it also is through job creation. We need to create jobs through investment, particularly investment in infrastructure. South Central Pennsylvania needs that kind of investment, and that's going to be one of my first priorities legislatively.
Well, let's talk about how much and how quickly then. Do you have specifics?
In terms of the minimum wage?
Yes.
I would propose raising it up to the level of $15 between now and 2024, and then it would be indexed to inflation so that we would not have to go through this process repeatedly.
Okay, thank you very much. Congressman Perry.
Well, I'm a person that's actually worked for less than minimum wage on several of the jobs that I started out. And so what I know is it's important that when you want a job and you might not have any skills, when you were a young person as I was, the only skill I had was to show up with a good attitude. But I had that and I wanted to work. But I had to learn some things. I don't think the answer is for the government to decide what our wage is. One minimum wage for the whole country, the same wage in San Francisco as in Glen Rock? To me, that's absurd. And I think the Tax Cut and Jobs Act proves that if we let people keep more of their money, especially businesses, they will give more to their employees. And we saw numerous bonuses and raises, and wages are coming up at 2.8%, having been held flat for over a decade easily. And so wages are coming. The best way to handle this is to let people keep more of their money, and they'll decide. And it also provides portability, right? Because there are more jobs available, and if you don't like this job or the wage that you're getting, as long as you're willing to work hard and show up with a good attitude, I suspect you can get another job at a higher wage. So I don't think it's the government's place to homogenize that wage and determine that New York City is the same wage as York City.
But you can't pay your mortgage with a good attitude, and it's been
Yes,
research
ma'am.
shows that there is no major city in the U.S., including here in Pennsylvania, that you can even afford your mortgage, your rent,
Right.
your housing on minimum wage right now. So you're not in favor of raising it.
I'm not in favor of raising it because the minimum wage was never meant to be the wage that you were supposed to make when you were keeping a family. It's for people that are getting started out. And if we raise that minimum wage, as some cities have, literally unemployment goes up, employment goes down because the businesses cannot pay that wage and they have to shed those employees. And so the net gain is not a gain, it's a loss. You lose workers.
You look, Mr. Scott, like you wanted to rebut.
Well, I think just from a factual standpoint, the minimum wage, this is a myth that it's only for people starting. As it exists today, the majority of the people who are earning the minimum wage are not teenagers or people in their early 20s. They're older than that. And in fact, 51% of those who earn minimum wage are women. They suffer from lower wages, and we need to get equal pay for everyone. And I think the minimum wage is part of doing that. Above and beyond that, I think it's a great idea to say that companies will share that wealth with their employees, and yet what we saw with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was that the majority of those funds went to stock buybacks and dividends, which didn't increase the working capital of companies, and it didn't create jobs opportunities here in South Central Pennsylvania.
I don't think you can say that anywhere. I mean, the market's up 7,000 points since the president took office and since we passed this bill. I mean, there's businesses that are expanding, and I have seen many of those businesses expanding. And if you look at how many people they're looking to hire right now, the number of people that we're looking to hire versus the number that are able to be hired or willing to be hired, that gap is growing. So what we have is a problem, obviously, but it's better than the problem of unemployment. Right now, we don't have enough workers to fill the jobs. That actually pushes wages up. And so that's, if you have to choose one of the two problems, that's the better one to have.
Well, it may be because workers are going to our surrounding states, which pay more.
And that might be true, but that's not a federal problem, that's a state problem. And I would agree with you, and that's why we need Governor Wolf and the legislature to make some changes so we're more competitive with the states around us.
So you would support raising it in Pennsylvania, but not federally?
I don't think it's not a federal issue. If it is anything, it is a state and local issue.
And you would support raising it statewide?
That wouldn't be a federal question. That's for the states to decide.
Okay, thank you very much.
We both mentioned our next topic, leads right into it pretty naturally. This goes back to Congressman Perry of this question. The Republican-led tax cuts have put some money in nearly all of our pockets, but also increases the national debt. What should be done with the tax cuts in the future? And what consequences concern you the most?
Sure. Well, the number is, generally speaking, for Pennsylvania families, $2,000 in your pocket annually of the money that you have already earned from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Now, you don't save money by taxing people more. The problem is that while we cut taxes, federal revenues are actually up 9% for the first half of the year, and I think 1.2 overall. We have to wait until the year's ended to see what the total difference is, but revenues coming into the federal government are actually up. The problem is spending is up at 3 times, which is why I often am in a position to have to vote for or vote against spending packages that require us to borrow and spend money that we don't actually have. So the answer for this is not to take more money out of people's pockets when they've earned it, but is to spend it wisely and judiciously. And we have a case at the federal government where we haven't done that over decades, which is why we've gotten into this $22 trillion debt circumstance. That's not going to end unless we quit spending money that we don't have.
Mr. Scott, future of the tax cuts?
Well, I certainly agree that we need to be fiscally responsible, but I don't think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a fiscally responsible measure. It added, according to the Congressional Budget Office, $1.9 trillion to the national debt over the course of its lifetime. Just in the past year, data that came out just this week showed that the federal deficit increased by $780 billion during fiscal year 2018 alone, while this new legislation is in place. The other problem with the Tax Cuts Act was that it was an uneven distribution of benefits. Yes, your average wage earner did receive a tax cut. But the problem is that when you look at those tax cuts, they were temporary. The tax cuts for the top end of the spectrum, for major corporations, for the top 1%, those tax cuts were and are permanent. And in the long run, 83% of the benefits, let me say that again, 83% of the benefits from the tax cuts will go to the top 1% of our society. That's not the kind of solution that I would support. We need to look at that top 1% benefit and relook that.
So 90% of Americans got a tax cut, and we voted in the House to make the tax cuts permanent for everybody. That's important to know. And while the deficit has been brought up once again, that's spending that I have voted against. And so I don't think it's going to be a good idea to take us back to the highest tax rate in the westernized world, which is what I think my opponent is saying that we ought to do. We had the highest tax rate in the world, in the modernized world, and we couldn't compete globally, which is why we saw our economy working at 2% as opposed to 4%, which is where it's been pretty much of this year.
I would just say I'm certainly not in favor of raising our tax rates to the highest in the world. And I would also point out that while the House may have voted to make the tax cuts permanent for everyone, reconciliation rules that operate in the Senate don't allow that to happen. And I'm a little bit surprised that Mr. Perry didn't know that.
I know that I have a vote in front of me. I'm not in the Senate running for the House, and you put your vote up for the things that are in front of you in the House. What the Senate does is another deal, but you've got to pass legislation in the House before it can be done in the Senate.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
All right, next question. We go first to Mr. Scott. A lot of voters are expected to go to the polls as a referendum this time around on President Trump. Do you think that's going to help or hurt you? And is Mr. Trump somebody you feel you can work with to make the Susquehanna Valley and Pennsylvania a better place to live? Mr. Scott?
Well, I'm running to help improve the lives of voters in South Central Pennsylvania. As far as I'm concerned, this is not a referendum on President Trump. This is about bringing better leadership to Washington, D.C., leadership that will reflect the voices and values of people here in South Central Pennsylvania, and that will make sure that we're looking out for interests of people at home rather than a particular group like, say, the Freedom Caucus in Washington, D.C. This should be about the people here at home. As far as the president, if there are policies that are serving the interests of the United States, for example, bringing home the remains of Korean War veterans from Korea, I'm fully supportive of that. Even the newly renegotiated Replacement Trade Act for NAFTA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Act, I think there's some benefit to that. Most of the farmers that I've talked to who are particularly affected by that think it's a step in the right direction. So I'm not completely, I'm not an ideologue. I'm a practical person who wants to work on bipartisan solutions that will benefit the people right here in this district. And at the end of the day, I think that's what voters want. They want representatives that will go down there and that will work hard on their behalf and make sure that their voice is heard and that their interests are represented. And that's exactly why I'm running.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Perry.
Well, I think, and I hope it will be a referendum on, is your life improved in the last 2 years? And if we look at, like I said, the market up 7,000 points, employment up, opportunity up, wages rising, hostages coming home, getting out of bad trade deals. This is all good news. And people in this district, and hopefully the new district, will learn that I am a good representative and I listen to all viewpoints. I don't go out and protest things and then come back to my office and say, well, come in and talk to me, and you don't know whether I'll call the balls and strikes correctly. I take all people that come in and meet with them and listen to their concerns and make the best choices I can with the things that are in front of me. And I think that that's what your representative is supposed to do, not go down there and be told by leadership what to do. We come to participate, not to take orders. We joined a different organization to take orders, but this isn't it, and I've told my leadership that. I support what the policies and the things that are important in this district, and I always have, and that's what I hope that the voters will be thinking about when they go to the polls.
Is this a president you enjoy working with?
I like his policies, and I think he's heading in the right direction. I think he's done things that haven't been done in a very long time. I do think he's a disruptor. It makes it uncomfortable for some folks, but I tend to look at not the drama. I try and stay out of the drama and stick to the policies, and I think the policies are working, and you're seeing the fruits of that all across the country.
All right, thank you both.
All right, we are off and running. Going to take a quick break now. More questions for the candidates when we come right back.
With Election Day less than a month away and the control of Congress in question, see the competition for yourself on C-SPAN. Watch the debates, from key House and Senate races. Make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018.
It's 19 days until the midterm elections, and tonight, President Trump will attend a campaign rally for Montana Republican U.S. Senate candidate Matt Rosendale. He's running against incumbent Democrat Jon Tester. The president gives his remarks in Missoula beginning live at 8:30 Eastern on C-SPAN 2. And coming up Monday, more campaign events as former President Barack Obama heads to Las Vegas for the Nevada Democratic Party Get Out the Vote rally. He'll be live at 4 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. And that evening, more from President Trump as he speaks at a rally in support of Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who's running against Congressman Beto O'Rourke for a second term in the Senate. You can see those comments live Monday at 7:30 Eastern, also on C-SPAN.
We return now to C-SPAN's live coverage of the Pennsylvania 10th District House debate between Republican incumbent Scott Perry and Democratic challenger George Scott, coming to us from Harrisburg, courtesy of WGAL-TV.
According to our partners at the AAUW, 72% of Pennsylvanians support some change to gun laws, mostly in favor of universal background checks on all gun transactions. What changes are you calling for to help reduce gun deaths?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that every single one of us expects, and when we think about school violence and guns in particular, every one of us expects for our children to go to school and come back in the same condition that they left. And of course, our hearts have all been broken on numerous occasions, too many occasions, whether it's in school or elsewhere. It's also important to point out that the gun deaths you talk about, the majority of them are by suicide. And I think that's important for people to know. This is an intractable problem because each one of us is going to raise our right hand and take an oath to the Constitution, not just some of the Constitution, but all of the Constitution, which says we have this right. So how do we fix this thing? And one of the things that I've been privileged to do is meet with the superintendents in the schools that I'm privileged to represent. And you'd be surprised, you would think that they would have kind of one answer, but they have multiple answers, and it really goes school to school to school. And I found out that, for instance, one of the things many of them want was resources for a counselor, not a guidance counselor, but a counselor to talk to the other students, because students don't want to tell on their friends, even if they know there's a problem, and they need that resource. Other schools might want, maybe in an older school, they want a different entryway put in because they can't afford it, but they can't secure the school. Still, other schools want resource officers. And so really it comes down to a local choice by the people on the ground dealing with the issue in their communities to determine how to fix this problem. Mental health is a component, but we got to be careful because not all people with mental health issues are a danger. But I think it's a component, and I think there's some place there where we can find some agreement.
Senator Mike Regan, in your district has done some great work at the state level in terms of the school safety angle. But what about sheer gun deaths? I know you mentioned suicides, and that's it's of course it's a huge number. But is there any policy you think you could get behind to just try to lower that gun deaths number? Well,
absolutely. Again, when I talk about people that maybe have a mental illness issue, whether they should have a weapon or not. But we got to be very careful there. Like I said, not all mental health issues are the same. And there are a lot of people that have mental health issues but are not a danger to anyone around them. However, there are some that are, and the reporting requirements and some other things associated with that deter people from kind of either self-reporting or reporting a family member because they are afraid they'll lose their rights. And there's a reluctance there. And I think there's some room for agreement.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, reducing gun deaths.
Well, first of all, I fully support the Second Amendment and always have. And what I think we need to have is a national dialogue on the fact that we have this epidemic of gun violence. 96 deaths a day is the number that we're looking at as a nation. This is a public health, public safety issue. So I think we need to start by understanding the issue. And one of the best ways to do that is to charter the Centers for Disease Control to do an in-depth study of this, a study which was prevented for many years by Congress, but I will be prepared to support legislation directing and funding them to do that. That will then give us a basis of evidence to work forward from. Beyond that, then, we need to make sure that we identify those who have guns. And 85 to 90% in polling support universal background checks. So do I. That's not an effort to take weapons away. That's just an effort to make sure that we know that anyone receiving a weapon doesn't have a violent criminal record or doesn't have a serious mental health issue or is not on some type of terrorist watch list. And then certainly we need to look at ways to reduce the lethality of weapons. Battlefield weapons are not intended for use in our communities. And finally, we do need to protect the schools, but we don't start there. You have to start left of the shooting incident in time and make sure that we are protecting them, but we are doing other things to reduce the threat.
Can I talk about that a little bit? I think that this is an issue that's so critical to us that we get it right, but it gets a lot of hyperbole around it because it's so emotional, as it should be. But we got to be careful because it is one of our rights. And with all due respect, my opponent took a gun and he took it apart and threw it in the fire as that's going to be the solution. Not only did he throw it in the fire, he characterized it as an AR-15 when it was a .22, what a Boy Scout would learn in hunter safety or something like that. I think it's important to characterize these things correctly so we don't sensationalize a problem, so that we can get to a solution that we all agree with. And I also want to say that over 100 people die from fentanyl and opioids across the country today, eclipsing not only gun deaths but car accidents as well. And that's important that we deal with that as well.
Certainly a question. That ad made a lot of attention all over the country. Do you want to respond to that?
Sure. It was an ad in a contested primary where we had an issue that we knew was important to voters, and I'm not afraid to speak out on issues that are important to voters. I'm not afraid of protecting voters right here in South Central Pennsylvania. And so the ad was, to the point that I made in that ad, was we need universal background checks, and we need to take a serious look at weapons that are intended for the battlefield. An AR-15 is simply a modified version of an M16 or an M4, and it's not intended for use in communities near schools or churches. I'm a pastor. I don't want an AR-15 anywhere near my church. None of us want those types of weapons near our schools. I don't want my son who's in high school or my daughter who's in college to be exposed to that kind of threat.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, take a breath, Mr. Scott, because this next one goes to you first. We want to talk about the environment. We've gotten a lot of email from people who'd like to ask this question. The United Nations just releasing a major report, 91 scientists from 40 countries warning that climate change is now happening so quickly that in little more than a decade, Earth could suffer a catastrophic breakdown. First, do you believe in climate change? And if so, how would you work to turn the tide? Mr. Scott.
I do believe in climate change. I think the scientific evidence in support of it is overwhelming. And to say that the climate changes naturally, of course it does, but the rate of change is the issue, and that's what the science is pointing to. The rate of change is far beyond anything we've ever seen. And so we need to work now and not keep kicking this can down the road. This is an issue that could potentially have a drastic effect on our children and grandchildren. So we have a moral obligation to make sure that we hand off to them an Earth that has a climate that's balanced. What I would specifically support is moving us as a nation through market-driven forces towards renewable energy sources. One of the best ways to do that is a policy referred to as the climate fee and dividend policy. Now, my opponent is going to tell you that it's a tax. It's not a tax. It's revenue neutral. It takes a fee that's put on carbon-based fuels at the point of production or entry into the country, and then that fee is distributed as a dividend to consumers. So for consumers, there is in fact no fee, no additional cost. But what it does is, as the cost of carbon fuels goes up, governments and businesses gradually move away from fossil-based fuels and move towards renewable sources of energy. In the long run, that type of program will not only reduce carbon emissions by 33% in a decade, it will also create 2.1 million new jobs. Those are the kind of jobs that we want to have right here in South Central Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Representative Perry.
Well, certainly, the climate is changing, and the climate always has, and I think everybody has to agree with that and believe that. I think obviously man has a part to play in that. We know that CO2 is in the atmosphere and it affects it, but the question is how? And then what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And what do we do with all the other nations that pollute much more than the United States? As a matter of fact, last year, the United States had the greatest reduction in CO2 emissions. So we are doing our part. But the program that my opponent is espousing from the UN, a couple things to know about. It's already been tried in Australia, some metrics that go with that. CO2 actually went up, the deficit went up, the costs went up, and unemployment went up. If we're going to do that, we should look to them and say, how did this work for you, and do we want to do this in America? And by the way, the very UN plan that my opponent has talked about also said that it would raise fuel prices, gasoline for your car, anywhere from $1 to $50 a gallon on top of what you're already paying. I think you have to proceed very carefully here before we do that to our people in central Pennsylvania and across the United States.
You talked about some of the progress that has been made. That was made under the emissions controls that the Obama administration put into place.
And other administrations.
Yes, but he worked toward that, and the current president has worked to roll much of that back, cutting the EPA in many ways, actually. And I believe you've voted for those things.
In some cases, I have. What we don't want to do is put ourselves in a position where we're paying countries like India and China to clean up their mess, and we cut our emissions, and they could continue to pollute for another 20 years, and then the United States economy has to pay for it. And that's what we're working towards. We want to clean up our mess, but we want them to clean up their mess and pay for their cleanup as well. We'll help them, but we can't be responsible for it and pay for it.
How specifically do you want to help clean up the mess here?
Well, here? Mm-hmm. Well, continue to move forward with things like, the economy does a great job. You look at what natural gas has done to some of those CO2 emissions from our coal-fired plants. That was going to happen as a natural progression of the economics of natural gas and our availability to get it. And of course, Pennsylvania, rich in coal, but also rich in natural gas, and we're sitting right on that. And so we moved many of our plants from coal to natural gas just because of the economics. And just by doing that, not with the requirement of government, we've really helped clean up our atmosphere. We just need to continue to do these things in a market-based fashion, and they actually do work.
I don't want to take too much time on this, but no Republican, no Democrat. If we don't have an Earth, none of us have a place to live.
Right.
So.
Exactly. And while natural gas is better than coal in terms of not contributing to climate change, the reality is it still does contribute to climate change. And as far as gas prices going up, gas prices have gone up more in the past year than at any time that they did during the 4 previous years. So we need to focus on the fact that we need to take action on this, and the U.S. must continue to be a leader in climate change as it was in the past and not abandon its role.
All right, thank you.
All right, we're about halfway through this debate. More questions for the candidates are straight ahead.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Friday morning, Heritage Action for America Executive Director Tim Chapman discusses his group's role in the 2018 midterm elections. Then NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson talks about his organization's efforts to increase African American turnout in this year's midterm elections. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live at 7 Eastern Friday morning. Join the discussion. C-SPAN, where history unfolds daily. In 1979, C-SPAN was created as a public service by America's cable television companies. And today, we continue to bring you unfiltered coverage of Congress, the White House, the Supreme Court, and public policy events in Washington, D.C. and around the country. C-SPAN is brought to you by your cable or satellite provider. We return now to C-SPAN's live coverage of the Pennsylvania 10th District House debate between Republican incumbent Scott Perry and Democratic challenger George Scott, coming to us from Harrisburg, courtesy of WGAL-TV.
For our industries and international markets. But farmers here in Pennsylvania say the tariffs are hurting their bottom lines. What is your message to those farmers, and what kind of future for tariffs will you fight for in Washington?
Well, the message to the farmers, as I understand, and of course, I grew up picking fruit and working on a farm, so not only from the policy perspective, but from the doing business end of the perspective. And of course, I go to church with farmers and so on and so forth. So I'm very attuned to what they're dealing with, whether it's milk or whether it's grain or what have you. And I know that they're suffering. One of the reasons they're suffering is for trade agreements like the one we had in NAFTA with Canada, for instance, where we couldn't sell our dairy products from Pennsylvania into Canada, but that they could sell theirs into ours. This is painful. And I don't like tariffs because they hurt the consumer. The consumer ends up paying more. But the administration, our government, has few options, right? What are we going to do? We're going to do a tariff, we're going to do a sanction, or we're going to do military action. Military action certainly isn't the right answer. If you're going to sanction somebody, what's the punishment? We made these agreements. So the president is trying to force better agreements that have been made over a long period of time and update them. And the only way to get some of these folks to come to the table is with the threat of tariffs. And in the meantime, the administration has also rolled out money and funds to make up the difference for the farmers in the meantime while the deals are coming together. And you can see that they are coming together. NAFTA now changed with the agreement with Canada and Mexico. The EU is trying to get in line because they see what's happening. South Korea is already there. Japan is right behind them. Australia. The big one is China. And this is to isolate China so that they quit stealing our intellectual property and taking advantage of our economy.
Mr. Scott, future of tariffs?
Well, as someone who grew up on a farm and who has a daughter who's studying agriculture in college and has a congregation filled with farmers, I'm deeply concerned about this issue, and I've met and talked with farmers on numerous occasions. The tariffs have, quite frankly, hurt our farmers in a way that was unnecessary. To imply that the only ways we have to deal with trade, with bad actors in the trade arena, is either tariffs or weapons, or to do some type of sanctions, completely overlooks the fact that diplomacy is one of the most effective things that our nation has. And so we should use diplomacy, and in particular, we should use the World Trade Organization. The United States has succeeded in over 91% of the claims that we put before the World Trade Organization. That's the way to deal with this, and particularly we need to go after China. But we should not be targeting our allies like Canada or the European Union with tariffs that hurt the farmers back here terribly. Soybean prices have practically collapsed, and prices for dairy and other industries are very low. And those farmers are paying the price for that day to day.
Our allies, I'm sure they are our allies, but they're happy to take advantage of our markets when they can, and they have, and they continue and will continue to do that. And diplomacy, unfortunately, hasn't gotten us any better. And relying on the World Trade Organization, which allows China to continually cheat, regardless of how many cases we win, they continually cheat, and to allow that and count on the World Trade Organization to deal with America's problems. We're representatives of the United States of America, not of the World Trade Organization, and that's what we need to be focusing on.
And I know the farmers have received some help, so is the message really, you got to just tough this one out, it's going to be better in the long run?
It's going to be better in the long run. That's exactly right.
That's a great message if you're not a farmer. Farmers need help, and they need it now.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Mr. Scott, the mission of our partners, the American Association of University Women, is to advocate for women, so let's talk about the wage gap. On average, women are paid 80 cents for every dollar a man gets for doing the same job. Will you work toward equal pay for equal work, and if so, how?
Yes, I will absolutely work towards equal pay for equal work for women. Women are the majority in our society, and hopefully they're going to soon be equal numbers, and even perhaps the majority within our Congress. They bring a unique perspective and a unique ethic with them. And so as the father of a daughter, I want to make sure that she has an opportunity to go out into the workplace and to receive equal pay for equal work. The wages that they have, they've got to be addressed through a variety of ways. One of the things that I'm very interested in doing is going to Congress and joining the Men for Women caucus, which is just being established by Congressman Don Beyer. It's a group that will be designed to speak up specifically, male elected leaders speaking up specifically for women on their behalf. I think we need to look across the board at ways that we can improve the situation for women, and in particular, increasing wages is one of those.
Thank you, Congressman Perry.
Well, absolutely. I will tell you, my mama taught me how to treat a lady. I don't have to join a caucus to do that. I have two little girls. Of course, my mom was the president of our company, and my wife is a career woman. This is actually fairly simple. One standard for everybody. You do the work, you get paid the wage. Now, I think what we can do, I think in cases of the past, maybe we discourage ladies from getting into certain different vocations. And there's no reason that it has to be done. I mean, women are in combat now. Women are doing everything that, generally speaking, men are doing, and they should be if they're capable of doing it. And so it's important that we acknowledge that in our society and say that these things can be done by everybody and earn a commensurate wage.
You're a three-term congressman. Have you worked on this issue yet?
Yeah, sure. With like the Skills Act, to make sure that everybody was looking towards the thing where they could make the living that they want, aspire to that wage, that salary level based on their work. Absolutely. We've passed legislation to deal specifically that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, this question begins with Congressman Perry. The images of family separation shocked a lot of people. We learned just this week the Trump administration says 66 children remain in U.S. custody after they were separated from their parents who entered the country illegally this summer. Give us your top 2 priorities for immediate immigration reform.
Well, first of all, every single one of us, whether you're a parent or not, you see those little children, they're abandoned, they're at a strange place, and you can only imagine how horrific that is, and your heart is broken from them, however they got there. And, you know, I think we have to acknowledge, too, that many of them were separated before they got to the border, and they're with someone that is trafficking them. And so from my standpoint, especially in protecting the children that come to the border, is making sure that they're not trafficked. If they're coming to the border, we have an obligation. If they're with their parents, then we have to deal with that appropriately. And the best thing to do would be to revise our immigration laws so that everybody, like my grandmother and my great-grandmother, came legally, so that it doesn't encourage people to come illegally and discourage legal immigration, because it's too tough in many cases. And I've said many times that our immigration system is broken and needs to be revamped. I was privileged to work on the two bills, Goodlatte 1 and Goodlatte 2, as they were characterized over the summer on immigration reform, which was going to reform a whole host of these things and make sure that we had appropriate levels, and it was a merit-based immigration system, so it dealt with what our country needs as well as the other countries that and the individuals that want to come to our country while doing it safely. Unfortunately, we only got 195 votes. We needed 218 to pass. I urged our leadership to go back. We could give a little on each side and get something passed. I'm hoping we take it back up when we come back in.
So is that an important policy to push? A merit-based system is an important step in the right direction?
Yeah, the world is changing, and we got to know who's coming in here for what purpose. Most of the stays, 40% of people that are here illegally are actually visa overstays. So you came legally, and then you just stayed, right? So we have to fix those problems.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Scott, top 2 priorities for immigration reform.
Right, so we have to have comprehensive immigration reform, but we have to do it in a bipartisan manner. To refer to the Goodlatte legislation as being a piece of legislation that was a good solution reflects the fact that this is not a bipartisan approach that you see from my opponent. There was not a single Democrat that voted for that bill, and in fact 41 Republicans voted against that bill because they didn't feel it was the right solution. So we need to develop bipartisan solutions to immigration. It is a tough issue, and bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. Above and beyond the general improving comprehensive immigration reform, we need to also look at securing our borders, but doing it in a responsible and compassionate way, not tearing children away from their families, as has been done under the current administration. And finally, I would point out the figure Mr. Perry cites of I think it was 41%, he said, of the children are being trafficked illegally. The reality is, according to government data, less than 1% of the children that cross the border are being crossed by traffickers. Most of them are coming with someone in their family.
Okay, just to be clear, I didn't use a 40% term regarding trafficking of children. Trafficking of any child is horrific.
Okay, we cannot talk about immigration without talking about the wall President Trump promises to build on the Mexican border. First, a quick yes or no from both candidates. Do you support building a wall? Mr.
No.
Scott?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, now let's dive a little deeper. We'll begin with Mr. Scott. As taxpayers, do you think we should be concerned about construction costs, which are still unknown, but the Government Accountability Office now says we will be billions more than the president has stated? You're not in favor. If you're elected, how are you going to work with a president who has made this a campaign promise? Well,
I understand the president has made it a campaign promise, but the reality is that the costs are going to be huge. A minimum of $25 billion is the price quoted by the president. Other government estimates say it could go up to $75 billion. Those are funds that we can better use for priorities right here at home, like improving our infrastructure, which would create jobs and help people right here in South Central Pennsylvania. Building a wall will certainly help some contractors who are lucky enough to get those lucrative contracts, but static structures like a wall are not the most effective way to prevent illegal immigration. We have all kinds of different technological means which can and should be employed along the border, and we need to continue to support those who are working on border security. They have got an incredibly difficult mission, and I want to make sure that they are supported and funded in their mission and have the training and resources that they need.
Congressman Perry, you want the wall. How are we going to pay for it?
Cost is always important. We would hope to have the help of some of our neighboring countries pay for that, and I think that's a deal that can be made between the two countries.
They have clearly said they are not paying for it, Mr. Trump.
Yes, I know they have, but we're the
president.
largest economy in the world, and they want to trade with us, and there's an impetus there for them to work together with us, and I think that they should, and I think that we can. And I think we can't discount the cost of illegal immigration, whether it's prisons, whether it's our healthcare system, education system. Those things are big costs that are happening right now, every single day in all of our communities, and we can't discount the cost of human trafficking, and we can't discount the 100 fentanyl deaths coming across our border every single day. It's up 750% this year, fentanyl coming into this country. They bring it across the border today, and tomorrow it's in your community via U.S. mail. That's a cost, too, that we can't disregard.
And you think the wall will stop that?
I think it'll help.
Okay, thank you very much.
More questions coming up after another quick break. We'll have these candidates and big finish straight ahead.
It's 19 days until the midterm elections, and tonight, President Trump will attend a campaign rally for Montana Republican U.S. Senate candidate Matt Rosendale. He's running against incumbent Democrat Jon Tester. The president gives his remarks in Missoula beginning live at 8:30 Eastern on C-SPAN 2. And coming up Monday, more campaign events as former President Barack Obama heads to Las Vegas for the Nevada Democratic Party Get Out the Vote rally. He'll be live at 4 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. And that evening, more from President Trump as he speaks at a rally in support of Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who's running against Congressman Beto O'Rourke for a second term in the Senate. You can see those comments live Monday at 7:30 Eastern, also on C-SPAN.
We return now to C-SPAN's live coverage of the Pennsylvania 10th District House debate between Republican incumbent Scott Perry and Democratic challenger George Scott, coming to us from Harrisburg, courtesy of WGAL-TV.
This is WGAL's debate with the two candidates running for the 10th Congressional District. We get right back to our questions. This question begins with Congressman Perry. Which political action committees or PACs are funding your campaign, and in any way does that impact your actions in Washington?
First of all, I'm sure that we get donations from, just like all candidates, from different organizations. Some of those are PACs. Some, I have no idea. They put up messages and advertisements. I've never talked to them. They've never talked to me, and so I have no control of it. I am not a big fundraiser. I try to spend my time in Washington, D.C. and in the district working on what I think the people that sent me there want me to do, which is working on legislation, working on constituent services, and doing the work of a servant. Unfortunately, fundraising is a part of it with the redistricting, as you can see. As I told many people, this is going to change dramatically. We're going to see something we've never seen here in central Pennsylvania before, which was this huge influx of outside money, which we're not used to, and it's changing the dynamics of this campaign. It's gone negative very early, which is unfortunate. I've never run a negative ad either. So, but regardless, people, I think, support my position, whether they're an individual that sends $5. I was knocking on doors just the other day in Derry Township, and a man said, "Hold on, I want to give you a check." That's never happened to me before. I think they support my positions. I try and do the right thing every single time, regardless of where the contributions come from. And if anybody says to me, "Well, I gave you a contribution, I expect this or that," the contribution goes right back.
Mr. Scott?
Well, I've taken a pledge from an organization called End Citizens United, and it's designed specifically to make sure that we decrease the influence of dark money on our political process. And so what that means is I have not accepted any money from corporate PACs. My opponent has. In fact, over $150,000 of donations have come into him over the years from healthcare organizations and pharmaceuticals, which obviously affect your decision-making process when you're a legislator. That's not the case with me. He's taken money from the Koch brothers. That's not the case with me. The overwhelming majority of my contributions are individual contributions, and the overwhelming majority of them are from people right here in South Central Pennsylvania. It's an indication of the broad grassroots support that we have for this race, because people just want a representative who's going to listen to them and work for them and their interests in Washington, D.C., and that's why I'm running. That's what this is about.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. We're running short on time. It's good to as many questions as we can.
All right, Mr. Scott, with America becoming more divided along party lines and poised to vote accordingly, give one example of how you differ from your party's stance on an issue.
Right, so many in my party have made a pledge to support Medicare for all. I have said that That's one option amongst many, but I don't think we have the money to pay for that right now. So what I think is we need a fair, gradual approach, which, as I said at the beginning, will stabilize the Affordable Care Act, repair it and improve it, and then we identify other ways to move forward, ways that are bipartisan. I'm committed to going to Washington, D.C. and working with people across the aisle. That's why I'm committed to joining the Problem Solvers Caucus. It's a caucus composed of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and people that will come together and work on solutions that will solve the issues we face. They are also in favor of open rules, which will improve the legislative process. They are the complete opposite of the Freedom Caucus, which is frankly the far right wing of the Republican Party, and it's an organization that my opponent belongs to.
Well, once again, I marvel at folks that talk about something they know nothing about. I was part of the Problem Solvers Caucus. Quite honestly, they don't solve any problems. They get together and it's a way of showing you're bipartisan from Washington, D.C. But
isn't
really,
that what Congress is supposed to be?
It is supposed to be, right, absolutely. But they don't really solve anything. Now, I'm a member of the Freedom Caucus, and just to let everybody, what is the Freedom Caucus, right? The Freedom Caucus has a couple rules. Number one rule is you have to listen to your constituents at home, even if your leadership says you don't. Right? They want you to do something, you choose your folks at home. Number two, you have to be willing to compromise and come to an agreement on something. We call it getting to yes, but that's what negotiate, come to an agreement on something you can vote on. And so I think that is actually a problem-solving caucus. And what we have done, for instance, is we force the requirement to make the tax cuts permanent, so we actually do get things accomplished. And number two, one of the things that I think my party needs to get to is transparency in drug pricing. The United States is the largest purchaser of drugs. We ought to know what we're paying for and how much we're paying for it.
Well, the president and Republicans are backing that, though. Is there an example of something where you're totally reaching across the aisle to your Democratic colleagues?
Yeah, I've passed 10 bipartisan bills in this session alone. The first bill I passed was with Grace Meng, a representative Democrat from New York, and President Obama signed it. So I'm happy and often work bipartisan.
Okay, thank you very much.
This question begins with Congressman Perry. Americans are increasingly divided along political party lines. What are you going to do to try and unite the country, erase that line in the sand, and get the work of the people done?
So what I do is I can't control anybody else, but I think that every leader, whether you're at the township, whether you're a newscaster, we all have a role to play in being role models. And so I try and, again, stay out of the drama. I try not to amp up the conversation. You know, they put a mic in my face. What do you think of so-and-so's comments? I try not to, keep on raising the level. And of course, look, I am flawed, I am imperfect, but every time in my actions, I try and exemplify what I would like my little girls to see every day when they turn on the TV or hear somebody talking. That's what I can do. And I think that's probably the most that any of us can do, because it seems like the more we argue over he said, she said, the worse it gets. I don't engage in those things. I don't go out to restaurants and yell at people that are of the other party, and I don't go protest, and I don't get into all this hyperbole. I just keep my nose to the grindstone, live clean, enjoy my family, and work very hard for the district that I represent. And I think that's the best thing we can do, is live and set an example every single day in everything we do.
And you're not hiding from our microphones or cameras tonight. Thank you for that. Mr. Scott, how would you unite the country, erase that line in the sand, and get the work of the people done?
Well, my faith teaches me that two most important things we're supposed to do are love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. And I think that last part has been largely forgotten here within this district and within many circles in our nation. So what I want to do is make sure that we are reaching not just to help those who are living in the top 1% of our society, but they're actually helping our neighbors. This district is filled with middle class, working class, and working poor voters who have not been given the kind of assistance that they need, the hand up, not the hand out, but the hand up they need in order to improve their lives. And so in order to do that, I will pursue bipartisan approaches. But above and beyond that, my experience, whether it's been during my time in the military, in the federal government, in the private sector, or in the church, is that it starts with personal relationships. So I intend to build personal relationships, not just within my own party, but also across the aisle. And to say that you've sponsored bipartisan legislation when the legislative record doesn't support that, I think is a little bit disingenuous. The reality is my opponent has sponsored 3 bills that have actually had bipartisan sponsorship, and only one of those has passed.
You care to respond?
Yeah, I do. Again, I know that my opponent's not in Congress, but it's not just bills, it's amendments, and you have to work to get those passed as well. Sure, we sponsor bills, everybody does, and not everybody agrees, but it's where the rubber hits the road, it's what you get accomplished that really counts. And again, just this session alone, not even 2 years, 10 pieces of legislation, whether standalone bills or amendments, passed with bipartisan support. I think that's a record of success, and I stand on that record, and that record's out there for everybody to see.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, we want to give the candidates a chance to make a final pitch for your vote. So we're going to give you each 1 minute for a closing statement, starting with Congressman Perry.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my mom escaped her father's abuse and my father's abuse and moved her two young little boys to Pennsylvania to get as far away as she could from him. And we grew up in a house that didn't have any electricity. We had an outhouse out back, and but we loved each other. She had to work many jobs and to keep us in that house and fix that house up over time. And I looked around at how my mother was treated, and I thought, you know, we could do better than this. People like my mom that were really struggling. I looked at how government treated them. I looked at how government treats our veterans. I looked at how government and some of our politicians stole from my mother in Medicare when they took $700 billion out of it to prop up a program that known as Obamacare that is failing. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a choice for two very different futures. One that is of resist and one that is of results. One of rising employment, rising opportunity, rising wages, a rising market, or one of chaos and one of divisiveness. I ask that you consider me when you go to the polls this November. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Scott.
I began running for Congress last year because I was deeply concerned about the divisiveness that I see in our nation today, not just within the political realm, but also within communities, families, and congregations. I'm also running because I'm deeply concerned about the plight of people right here in South Central Pennsylvania, the number of people that are struggling to get by, to make ends meet. I'm running to restore integrity to our political process, to promote policies that will serve all the people, and to move us forward together as both a nation and as a district. You know, we've seen a lot of change here in South Central Pennsylvania in the last decade, and it's time to see change in the leadership in Washington, D.C. as well. It's time to bring integrity and service and compassion to Washington, D.C., and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Once elected, I will work for you and for you only. This is a new district. It's time for new leadership in Congress, and I ask for your vote on November 6th.
All right. Just a quick question. If the other one's elected, will you guys be able to work with that person? Will you stay in politics and work with them?
I work with anybody.
Well, I will return to ministry because I'm a pastor, and that's my plan.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of our candidates for joining us, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in this evening.
Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 6th. Polls are going to be open from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. And if you're in line when the polls close, you are entitled to vote. Only those of you voting for the first time in a new district need to show ID. Acceptable ID includes both photo and non-photo ID.
In addition to governor, you'll be voting for a U.S. Senate seat, Congress, and the General Assembly. All of the state House seats are up. Half of the state Senate seats are also for re-election this year. You can check your registration status and find your polling place on this website. That's votespa.com.
Again, thank you for watching tonight. Don't forget to get out and vote. It's where you have the power. Good night.
Good night.